Wolfman is written by Corbett Tuck and Leigh Whannell and is directed by Whannell. Years after cutting off contact with his father, Blake, played by Christopher Abbott, must return to his childhood home in rural Oregon after his father dies. In an attempt to fix his marriage, he brings his wife Charlotte, played by Julia Garner, and his daughter Ginger, played by Matilda Firth. When they get near his old home, they run into a bipedal creature that starts to hunt them. This is actually Leigh Whannell's second remake of a Universal movie monster after The Invisible Man, which was a movie that was surprisingly good and made me look forward to this remake quite a bit. Whannell has been in the industry for a minute, having also directed the visually fun Upgrade and surprisingly decent Insidious 3, while also being a writer for the Saw series. Now, unfortunately, this attempt was fairly disappointing compared to Whannell's last two movies, and ultimately I think it comes down to an underdeveloped script. There is a lot of good here. Whannell has an eye for visually striking images, and the sound design for the movie is fantastic. One of the better sequences is when the main character's hearing starts to change, so everything becomes distorted and amplified. Christopher Abbott also turns in a really solid performance as Blake. Abbott is an actor that I've seen in a handful of projects for the last couple of years, and he pretty much always comes off as believable. He does here too, and I think he was a good choice for the lead. I also liked how the daughter was written for most of the movie. Her introduction scene reminded me of how my little sister would talk around that age, so it came off as authentic to me. And Matilda Firth does a solid job, which can always be a hit or miss for child actors in horror movies, and she's not a weakness here. This remake's approach is similar to that of The Invisible Man. Instead of the test tube scientist science fiction origins, it's stripped down to represent interpersonal conflicts and grounded in real life problems. The Invisible Man was about domestic violence. Wolfman is about generational trauma, and apparently one of their approaches was that of living with a dementia patient. And if that is truly the approach behind this, I feel a little odd about that. I don't know if that's in the best taste, but I don't know if that's even for me to say, so I'll move past that. In this film, Blake lived with his father in a very remote location in the forests of Oregon. His dad was incredibly overbearing and focused on teaching Blake that everything was dangerous and that he needed to protect himself. The opening sequence to this movie was actually pretty solid and did a good job of setting up the themes for it and kind of what the tone was going to be, the tension, and it does keep that same tension for most of the movie. We see Blake has shunned the intense approach his dad had, but does take the responsibility of protecting his family very, very seriously. Some long-standing tension between him and his wife is established, and they are attempting to rekindle something with this trip because after his father dies, he is the one who's supposed to go pack up everything in his house. While I do appreciate and like the setup for these characters and the story, the movie never truly expands on developing them or the plot in any meaningful way after the halfway point. It mostly relies on a motif between Blake and Ginger to hit its theme home, which emotionally works somewhat, but could have worked a lot better if they took a little bit more time to develop it. Whannell is able to do a lot with how paper thin the plot really is, but the second half of the movie is basically just everyone running and hiding, rinse and repeat, over and over again. The marital issues aren't addressed after they run into the Wolfman that made them crash their moving truck. This leaves Julia Garner's character with very, very little to actually do other than react to the situations happening around her. I do like her characterization and that she's not helpless, but we know next to nothing about her as a character. And to give Julia Garner credit, she does a good job here. I'm a fan of hers because I've been a fan of Ozark since it premiered, so I'm always excited to see her in a new project. This movie does take most of the runtime for Blake to transform. While I'm not against this concept because I believe it was going for more of an approach like Cronenberg's The Fly, I was disappointed with the end product. The approach to werewolves is different in general. Instead of the traditional lycanthrope approach, the Wolfman is regarded to more as a cryptid in this movie. And I do honestly like this idea, but I do wish the look of the Wolfman looked a little closer to a werewolf. It is more nitpicky to get upset about that, but if you spend the majority of the second and third act transforming into something else, then I think they should have made him transform into something more visually intimidating or unrecognizable from the original person's look. An American Werewolf in London did usher in focusing on the transformation aspect of werewolf stories and movies, but its famous transformation scene still holds up much better because of how visually insane it is. And to give credit where credit is due, there are some well done scares and some good makeup. The practical makeup is pretty solid throughout this. There's one scene in particular where Blake scratches at a wound like a dog and digs into it frantically. And the visceral goriness of that worked pretty well. And while I was writing this review, I did think that this was rated PG-13 and was going to say there's a surprising amount of gore for a movie of that rating, but it's actually rated R. And unfortunately, I'm going to be a little hypocritical and say that there definitely could have been more body horror in general for an R-rated horror movie of this kind. Like I said before, I did like what Whannell did visually. He focuses on longer, wider takes, and it does help you understand the environment. I really liked the scenes where it switched back and forth from Blake to Charlotte's perspective, showing what either of them were seeing while he is transforming. There is some fun stuff done with lighting here, and I really appreciated that approach to it. Whannell is always interesting when he does things like this, and Whannell's direction is ultimately what saves the movie from being a dud. I like the approach being similar to The Invisible Man with being grounded and focusing on inherited trauma and family, but your allegories don't really hold up or hold any water when the substance of the story and the plot goes nowhere. You have to develop the story if you want your allegory to hold the meaning that you're hoping it holds. Because there is an emotional beat towards the end of the second act of this movie that's supposed to be kind of a reveal, and it doesn't really work in the way that it should. Once Blake starts to really feel the effects of the transformation, any character development stops dead in its tracks, and with that happening halfway through, the second half feels like it's waiting for something that never comes. I do think this was an okay movie, and wasn't by any means a fall from grace for Whannell, but it was ultimately disappointing for what I expected from him. So I will be rating Wolfman a C. I think this is a pretty average horror movie, but it is disappointing that it comes from Leigh Whannell. I hope that if he does stick with the Universal movie monster adaptations or remakes, that he can develop the next story a little bit more, a little bit closer to what The Invisible Man was doing rather than this. But what did you guys think? Did you like Wolfman? Do you like The Invisible Man more? What's your favorite original Universal movie monster? Let me know, and I will be back with another video.